Women in song. Wine. I'm not too crazy about wine.
The night nobody expected. In the early 1960s, Hollywood was a world of bright lights, expensive dinners, and secret deals hidden behind smiling faces. Actors charmed cameras while powerful men controlled careers from behind closed doors. Few people understood that world better than Dean Martin. Dean was famous for his smooth voice, relaxed humor, and calm personality. On stage, he looked completely at ease, but those close to him knew he noticed everything around him. He rarely argued or raised his voice, yet when someone crossed a line, his response was unforgettable. One night in Los Angeles, that quiet reputation would be tested. The restaurant on Sunset Boulevard was one of Hollywood's most famous spots. Producers, singers, and movie stars filled the room while soft piano music played in the background.
Those are the nominated songs. Now, who is the winner, do you know?
You open it, honey. I don't do sight bits.
Waiters moved carefully between tables, knowing every guest carried influence. Near the window sat Sophia Loren. Even among celebrities, she stood out. Elegant and confident, she carried herself with quiet dignity that earned respect from everyone around her. She wasn't known for diva behavior. She spoke kindly to staff and treated people with warmth. That evening, she was meeting several producers about a possible film project. Across the room sat Dean Martin. He wasn't part of the meeting. He had stopped in after a rehearsal, relaxing with a glass of bourbon while listening to the piano player. Dean enjoyed nights without attention, where he could simply observe the room around him. Then the atmosphere suddenly changed. The front door opened, and conversation softened for a moment. A tall man entered with two companions beside him. He wasn't a Hollywood celebrity, but many people recognized him immediately. He was a mob figure from the East Coast, known for money, influence, and a dangerous temper. The manager quickly greeted the mobster and led him toward a table, but the man's attention had already shifted toward Sophia Loren. He stared at her with a smile that made nearby guests uneasy. Instead of sitting down, he walked straight across the restaurant. Dean Martin watched quietly from his table. He didn't react. He simply observed.
I love to sing and I love women.
The mobster stopped beside Sophia and introduced himself loudly, showering her with exaggerated compliments. Sophia answered politely but kept her responses short. It was obvious she wanted the conversation to end. Her body language made that clear, but the man ignored it completely. As the seconds passed, his voice grew louder and more aggressive. Nearby guests avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice. In Hollywood, powerful men were rarely challenged. Most people stayed silent to protect themselves. Sophia finally stood, calmly preparing to leave the table. That was when everything changed. The mobster grabbed her arm. Sophia immediately pulled away, but in the next instant he struck her across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the restaurant. Somewhere in the room, a glass crashed onto the floor. Nobody moved. Producers stayed frozen in their seats. The staff looked terrified. Fear filled the room, except for one person. Dean Martin slowly placed his bourbon glass down and stood up. He didn't rush or raise his voice. The piano player stopped in the middle of a note as every eye turned toward him. Dean walked calmly across the restaurant. The mobster laughed when he saw him approaching. "Relax, singer," he said. "This isn't your business." Dean ignored him at first. He looked toward Sophia Loren, noticing the red mark forming on her cheek. Then he turned back to the mobster, calm, silent, completely unafraid. The tension became unbearable. Finally, Dean spoke. "You should leave." The mobster smirked. "And if I don't?" Dean gave a small shrug. That would be a mistake. One of the mobster's companions stepped forward, and the entire room expected violence. But something unexpected happened. The mobster studied Dean carefully and realized something everyone else already felt. Dean Martin wasn't afraid of him at all. After a long pause, the mobster forced out a laugh and raised his hands. "Fine," he said, "for the singer." He turned and walked out with his companions. The entire restaurant finally breathed again as Sophia quietly thanked Dean. The restaurant manager rushed over, apologizing repeatedly as staff cleaned the broken glass from the floor.
They want to think I'm lazy, but they know I work. I mean, could I be where I am today if I were lazy and if I were a boozer?
Within minutes, the music resumed, conversations returned, and Hollywood pretended nothing had happened. But Dean Martin understood something the others did not. Men like that rarely accepted humiliation quietly. 2 nights later, a package arrived at the mobster's home. Late that evening, a black car stopped outside the large estate where the man lived with his family. A delivery driver stepped out carrying a small wooden box with no return address attached. Only a single card rested on top. The guard brought the package inside. Curious, the mobster opened it expecting money, a threat, or perhaps a weapon. Instead, he found something much stranger. Inside the box sat one simple object beside a handwritten note. The moment he read the message, the color drained from his face. His wife immediately noticed the change. "What is it?" she asked softly. For several seconds, he didn't answer. He picked up the small card again, rereading the words carefully. His hands trembled ever so slightly, something his family had never witnessed before. This was a man known for intimidating others, not for fear. "What does it say?" his brother asked from across the room. The mobster stayed silent another moment before carefully placing the card back into the box. "We're leaving," he finally said. The room fell quiet. "Leaving where?" his wife asked. "Anywhere but here." His brother stepped closer, confused by the sudden panic. "Who sent this?" The mobster slowly exhaled. "Dean Martin." For most people, Dean Martin was simply a famous entertainer, a smooth singer with charm and humor. But in certain circles, his name carried a very different meaning: quiet influence. Dean had grown up around hard neighborhoods and dangerous people long before Hollywood fame found him. Over the years, he built connections with powerful figures in entertainment, politics, business, and even the criminal underworld. Most people underestimated him because of his relaxed personality. That was their mistake. Dean rarely used those connections, but when he did, the message was always understood immediately. And the mobster holding that wooden box understood perfectly. His wife finally leaned forward and looked inside. Resting neatly in the box was an elegant silver lighter, polished brightly under the chandelier light. At first glance, it seemed harmless, almost ordinary. But engraved along the side were 4 simple words: "Respect is remembered forever." Then came the second line of the note: "Next time, the message won't arrive in a box." There was no signature beneath it. None was needed. Everyone in the room already knew who had sent it. The mobster's wife stared at him carefully. "You're serious about leaving?" "Yes. But you've handled bigger problems than this before." The mobster slowly shook his head. "This isn't that kind of problem." His brother scoffed. "You're afraid of a singer now?" For the first time that night, anger flashed across the mobster's face. He turned toward him sharply. "You think this is about a singer?" he asked. He pointed toward the silver lighter inside the wooden box. "That symbol engraved on the side, do you know who uses it?" His brother hesitated. "No." "Exactly," the mobster replied quietly. "Because people like that don't advertise themselves." The room fell silent again. Finally, the mobster leaned back in his chair and spoke carefully. "Dean Martin didn't send this because he's angry." "Then why send it?" his wife asked. "Because somebody else noticed what happened." In Hollywood during that era, powerful figures often worked quietly behind the scenes. They weren't movie stars or politicians. but they influenced careers, reputations, and problems that never reached newspapers. Certain unwritten rules existed, and one of the biggest was simple. Respected people were not publicly humiliated, especially someone like Sophia Loren. When the mobster slapped her inside that restaurant, he hadn't just insulted an actress. He had created a public scene, and powerful people hated scenes that attracted attention. Dean Martin's message wasn't revenge. It was a warning, a reminder that some lines should never be crossed. The mobster finally stood from the table. "Call the driver," he told his brother. "Where are we going?" his wife asked. "Chicago first," he answered. "We'll decide the rest later." She studied his face closely. "You really think this could become something bigger?" The mobster glanced down at the lighter one final time before closing the box. "I don't think anything," he said quietly. "I just know that when someone like Dean Martin sends a message this polite, it means someone else wanted to send a much harsher one." Meanwhile, across the city, Dean Martin sat alone in his living room with a glass of bourbon resting in his hand. The television played softly in the background, but he wasn't watching it. Instead of watching the television, Dean Martin stared quietly at the Los Angeles skyline through his window. A friend sitting across the room finally broke the silence. "You think he got the message?" Dean smiled faintly. "Oh, he got it." "And if he didn't?" Dean shrugged casually. "Then somebody else would have delivered a second one." His friend laughed softly. "You could have handled that restaurant situation differently." Dean took a slow sip of bourbon. "No," he replied calmly. "I handled it exactly the right way." "Because of Sophia Loren?" Dean nodded. "Because of respect." The next morning, nothing about the restaurant incident appeared in newspapers. Hollywood had always been skilled at keeping uncomfortable stories hidden. But over the following days, people noticed something unusual. The mobster who caused the scene had completely vanished. No meetings, no public appearances, no returned phone calls. It was as if he had disappeared overnight. And in Hollywood, disappearances often spoke louder than headlines. 3 days later, Sophia Loren arrived at a film studio for a costume fitting. During a break, one producer casually mentioned the incident. "That man from the restaurant left town," he said. Sophia looked surprised. "Really?" "Very suddenly." She paused for a moment before quietly asking, "Dean?" The producer smiled slightly. "Let's just say he has powerful friends." Sophia looked out the window toward the city skyline before softly replying, "Sometimes kindness doesn't need to be loud." As the days passed, the story quietly spread through Hollywood. No interviews or public statements existed, only whispers between actors, producers, and studio executives. People admired the way Dean Martin handled the situation. Calm, controlled, and without unnecessary violence. In a city filled with loud egos and constant drama, Dean proved something important. Real power rarely needed to shout. Nearly 2 weeks later, most people in Los Angeles believed the story was over. Life returned to normal. The restaurant on Sunset Boulevard stayed busy every night while piano music drifted through the dining room as if nothing had ever happened there. But for the mobster who opened that wooden box, the story wasn't finished. Chicago felt colder than Los Angeles, not only because of the weather, but because of the atmosphere surrounding him. One evening, he sat inside a private downtown club, staring silently at a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched in nearly 20 minutes. His brother finally leaned forward. "You've barely spoken since we got here." The mobster nodded slowly, still staring at the untouched drink in front of him. "I'm thinking about mistakes." The mobster's brother leaned back in his chair. "You're still thinking about that restaurant?" The mobster slowly lifted his whiskey glass but never took a drink. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "No, I don't," his brother replied. "You've dealt with tougher men than some singer." The mobster looked at him sharply. "You keep calling him a singer." "That's what he is." The mobster shook his head. "That's what people see." He leaned forward slightly. "But that's not what he is." In certain worlds, reputation meant everything. Money could be regained. Lost business could return. But damaged respect created consequences that spread quietly and endlessly. The mobster understood those rules better than most people. He knew when to pressure others, when to intimidate, and when to walk away. But what happened with Sophia Loren had been different. Emotional, reckless, public. And now the consequences were appearing all around him. Since leaving Los Angeles, strange things had started happening. Important phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were suddenly postponed. Business partners became distant without explanation. Nobody threatened him directly. Nobody mentioned the restaurant incident. But the silence itself sent a message. 3 nights later, the mobster received a phone call from a man whose opinion carried enormous weight. Someone respected enough that people listened carefully whenever he spoke. "Where are you these days?" the man asked calmly. "Chicago." "I heard." The mobster waited quietly. Then the voice continued. "You embarrassed a lady." The mobster closed his eyes briefly. "I know. In front of half of Hollywood." "I know that too." A long silence followed before the man finally asked the question hanging over everything since the wooden box arrived. "Have you fixed it yet?" The mobster hesitated. "No." "Then you're not finished with this problem." The line grew quiet again. Before hanging up, the man delivered one final warning. "Dean Martin handled that situation gently. Don't make somebody else handle it differently." That sentence stayed in the mobster's mind long after the call ended. Later that night, he began packing his bags. His brother stood in the doorway watching him. "You're really going back to Los Angeles?" "Yes." "For what?" The mobster zipped his suitcase closed. "To repair something." His brother laughed in disbelief. "You're going to apologize." The mobster stopped and looked directly at him. "Yes, and if they don't accept it?" The mobster picked up the suitcase calmly. "That's not the point." Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, Dean Martin sat backstage at a Las Vegas theater after finishing another performance. The audience loved Dean Martin's performance that night. The music, the jokes, the effortless charm, everything had gone perfectly. But backstage, Dean seemed distracted. A stage manager approached him quietly. "Phone call for you." Dean glanced up. "At this hour? From Los Angeles?" Dean picked up the phone. "Dean speaking." The voice on the other end sounded familiar. "I hear someone may be returning to town." Dean smiled faintly. "Maybe." "You think he finally understands?" Dean leaned back in his chair. "I think he understands now." "And if he doesn't?" Dean paused briefly. "Then somebody else will explain it." 2 days later, the mobster returned to the same restaurant where the incident had happened. The moment he walked through the doors, conversations softened. People remembered him immediately. The manager spotted him first and looked uncertain, but the mobster calmly raised one hand. "I'm not here for trouble." The manager nodded carefully. "Of course." The mobster slowly scanned the room. He wasn't searching for Dean Martin. He was looking for Sophia Loren. Then he saw her seated near the window, quietly speaking with the director. For a few seconds, he stood still before finally walking toward her table. The restaurant grew silent again. Sophia noticed him approaching, her expression calm but cautious. The mobster stopped beside her table, and this time his voice carried none of the arrogance from before. "Miss Loren." She looked up at him. Yes? He hesitated briefly while the entire restaurant watched. I owe you an apology. Nobody in the room moved. What happened here 2 weeks ago was unacceptable, he continued quietly. Sophia studied him carefully. You came all the way back just to say that? Yes. Why? The mobster glanced around the room before answering. Because I made a mistake. Then he added something unexpected. And because someone reminded me what respect looks like. Sophia immediately understood who he meant. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Then consider the apology accepted. The tension inside the restaurant finally eased, but the mobster wasn't finished. There's one more thing, he said. Sophia waited. Where's Dean Martin? Later that evening, Dean entered the restaurant and immediately noticed the mobster seated alone near the back. Calmly, he walked over to the table. You looking for me? Dean asked. The mobster stood. Yes. To everyone's surprise, the two men shook hands. I apologize to Miss Loren, the mobster said. I heard, Dean replied. Is that enough? Dean studied him quietly for a moment. For her, maybe. And for you? Dean shrugged slightly. I was never the one who needed the apology. The mobster nodded slowly before asking one final question. Why didn't you threaten me that night? Dean smiled faintly. Because threats don't teach people anything. Then the mobster said something nobody expected to hear from him. You could have ruined me. Dean Martin picked up the menu from the table and glanced at it casually. Maybe, he replied. Then he looked back up. But ruining people isn't nearly as interesting as watching them learn. The two men continued talking quietly for nearly an hour. There were no threats, no anger, and no tension left between them. By the end of the conversation, the atmosphere felt almost peaceful. As they prepared to leave, the mobster stopped and asked one final question. I never asked what the symbol on that lighter meant. Dean laughed softly. You weren't supposed to. The mobster smiled faintly. So it was a bluff. Dean took a slow sip from his drink. Sometimes people behave better when they think the world is watching. The story of the apology never appeared in newspapers, but Hollywood didn't need headlines for stories to spread. Actors whispered about it on movie sets. Producers mentioned it quietly during private dinners. Over time, the lesson became part of Hollywood's unspoken culture. Respect mattered, especially when someone like Dean Martin was paying attention. As weeks passed, the city slowly moved on. That was the rhythm of Hollywood. One scandal disappeared the moment another arrived. New premieres, new gossip, and new headlines quickly replaced old stories. But the people inside that restaurant on Sunset Boulevard never forgot what happened that night. They remembered the silence after the slap. They remembered the fear in the room. But most of all, they remembered the way Dean Martin calmly walked across the restaurant without raising his voice. The story continued, spreading quietly through private conversations. Every version ended the same way. Dean Martin never shouted, never threatened, and never lost control. He simply made sure the situation corrected itself. What most people never understood, however, was why he handled it that way. Because the answer had very little to do with power. It came from something older than Hollywood itself. Several weeks after the apology, Dean sat outside a quiet Beverly Hills home late one evening. The night air was warm while a few close friends relaxed around the patio table sharing drinks and stories. Among them sat an older producer who had known Dean for years. After pouring another drink, the producer looked at him thoughtfully. You know something, Dean? Dean glanced over calmly. What's that? Dean Martin shrugged slightly. I just handled it the easiest way. The producer laughed. Easy? The whole city is still talking about it. Dean leaned back in his chair and smiled faintly. They're talking about the wrong part. The wrong part? The drama, Dean replied. That's all people noticed. For a moment, he stayed quiet, staring at the light stretching across the Beverly Hills hillsides. Then he asked softly, "You know why I stepped in that night?" The producer shook his head. "I figured it was because of the situation." Dean smiled. "No." "Then why?" Dean lifted his drink slowly before answering. "Because years ago, somebody did the same thing for my sister." The table fell silent. Dean almost never spoke about his family. "We grew up in a rough neighborhood," he continued quietly. "One night, my sister was walking home from work when a few men started following her." "What happened?" the producer asked. "A stranger stepped in," Dean replied. "He wasn't famous, wasn't important, just someone who saw what was happening and decided not to ignore it." Dean smiled faintly at the memory. "He walked beside her and told those guys to leave her alone." "And they listened?" "Eventually." Dean stared down into his glass for a second. "But the thing I never forgot wasn't what he said to them. It was what he said to her afterward." The group listened carefully. He told her, "Nobody should ever feel alone in a moment like this." A quiet silence settled over the patio. "I never saw that man again," Dean said. "Never even learned his name. But I remembered what he did." The producer nodded slowly. "So when you saw what happened in that restaurant," Dean finished the thought for him. "I remembered that promise." The producer smiled faintly. "You know, that explanation makes a lot more sense than the story Hollywood tells." Dean laughed. "And what story is that?" "That Dean Martin secretly controls half of Hollywood." Everyone around the table laughed. Dean raised his glass with a grin. "I can barely control my golf swing." At the same time, across Los Angeles, Sophia Loren was finishing a late-night interview. The journalist leaned forward curiously. "Hollywood can be difficult for women sometimes. Has anyone ever stood up for you in a moment that stayed with you?" Sophia smiled thoughtfully. "Yes." "Would you share the story?" She paused briefly before answering. "There was a night when someone reminded an entire room what respect looks like." "And who was that?" Sophia smiled softly. "A gentleman." Months later, Sophia Loren and Dean Martin crossed paths again at a charity event in Los Angeles. The ballroom buzzed with actors, musicians, and filmmakers while cameras flashed around the room. Dean approached her table with his usual relaxed smile. "Sophia." "Dean." They shared a warm embrace before Sophia looked at him seriously. "I never properly thanked you." Dean shook his head. "You don't need to." "But I do," she insisted. Dean smiled gently. "Then thank the man who once helped my sister." Sophia looked surprised. "Your sister?" Dean nodded. "Long story." She laughed softly. "Well, whoever he was, he raised a gentleman." Dean grinned. "I'm still working on that part." Years later, long after that night on Sunset Boulevard faded into Hollywood memory, the people who witnessed it still remembered one thing clearly. Not the slap, not the mobster, not even the mysterious wooden box. What stayed with them was much simpler. A man quietly standing up when everyone else looked away. Because courage doesn't always arrive with shouting or violence. Sometimes courage is calm, sometimes it's respectful, and sometimes it's simply one person refusing to let another feel alone in a difficult moment. That was the lesson Dean Martin carried with him for the rest of his life. And maybe that's why people never forgot the story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more unforgettable Hollywood stories. And until next time, thanks for watching.